of Israel's military capability, and we are a very significant source of financial support for Israel. We talked earlier about Egypt and the question of whether we should apply financial pressure on Egypt because of some things that were being done which we didn't like. Well, I think it's legitimate to raise the same question regarding Israel. But the fact of the matter is that right now, particularly in the course of a presidential campaign, I think it's highly unlikely that we'll apply that maximum pressure. The Israelis apparently have indicated to us that they will not give us advance warning if they decide to strike. I emphasize the word if. They may not have decided to undertake a strike, but if they do, they said they will not give us warning. So we will not be, in a sense, involved in their decision. Nonetheless, if they do strike, the fact is that, first, the Iranians really do not have the military capability to retaliate against Israel. Secondly, if they do strike, they may very well go over Iraq, which is still our responsibility in terms of airspace. That will make us de facto complicit. Third, because the Iranians cannot respond effectively and retaliate against Israel, but they'll view us as having connived or maybe even given it the green light, it is highly likely that they will retaliate against our interests. And they have several that they can go after immediately. One, they can make the situation in western Afghanistan increasingly difficult for us, and thereby complicate the entire strategy of gradual disengagement. Secondly, they can destabilize Iraq relatively quickly. Third, they can already, we see signs of it, affect the price of oil. And they could attempt to strike at some Saudi oil fields or interfere with the shipment of energy through the Strait of Hormuz, which we could keep open after they try to do so. But there's no doubt that the price of energy will escalate dramatically, and the tendency in that direction is already evident in the dramatic increase in the cost of insurance for the shipment of oil from the Strait of Hormuz. And that's why Americans are paying $4 a gallon. They'll then be paying $5 or $6 or $7 a gallon because of the Israeli strike on Iran. So the fact is, we will be drawn in if they do, and the consequences will be adverse for us. And this, I think, makes it all the more important that President Obama persists in the course on which I think he has embarked, which is to try to dissuade the Israelis from doing anything unilaterally and to give what has been described as give peace a chance, serious negotiations with Iran. But then what does serious negotiations with Iran mean in practice? Well, what they do mean is that you do not give the Iranians the choice of either humiliating capitulation or socioeconomic strangulation. That is to say, they either really bow totally and, for example, are deprived of the right to have a nuclear program, which under NPT they do have, or because they are not accommodating, we really shut down their economy, which will then have the effect of unifying the extremists with the nationalists and probably even precipitate some hysterical, crazy reaction militarily by the Iranians. So we do have to be very deliberate in our conduct and try to use the alliances that we have, plus China and Russia and others, to create a situation in which the peace process is given a chance. And my last point is, and we have time to do it, because on the highest authority, it has been stated by our president, by our military and intelligence leaders, and in effect confirmed by people who are really informed and following this, that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran is not something imminent, but years, we don't know how many, but years away. The Israelis have predicted since 1994, every single year, that the next year Iran will have the nuclear weapon. Since 1994. It's now 2012.
Any thoughts on the same issue?
Yeah, right. You have 10, 15 minutes? No.
What Dr. Brzezinski has outlined is why both under the Bush administration and under the Obama administration, we have said, look, the place where we do not want to be is where the only two choices are to accept an Iran with a clear path to a nuclear weapon or have to use a conventional military option. And we can have a debate about that, but both of them have very negative consequences. So where are we? Well, we're not in a good place. Can we live with Iran? And I think this is an issue between the United States and Israel. President Obama has said the red line is Iran with a nuclear weapon. I'm pretty sure the Israelis think, no, no, that's too late. By the time that you have a nuclear weapon, the damage is done. It is Iran with a nuclear capability, or as I say it, a clear path to a nuclear weapon, and it's clear the United States cannot prevent it. There are a lot of, once Iran achieves that point, its sense of empowerment in terms of throw its weight around in the region, support terror, other countries wanting to have their own route to a nuclear weapon, the risk that nuclear capability would be provided to terrorist groups. It's not a happy picture, and the notion you can deter all of those responses by threatening retaliation against Iran, I think is wrong. Secondly, I'm pessimistic on negotiations, not that we shouldn't try them. But this has always been, now for 10 years, it's about the enrichment program. The international community has said to Iran, you can have a truly peaceful nuclear program. We'll build it for you, for heaven's sake. But because of the suspicions we have, even though under the NPT you have a right to an enrichment and reprocessing program, we cannot trust you with it because we do not believe that you've given up nuclear weapons. We believe actually you're trying to get them. And so the problem on the negotiations is this has always been about whether Iran can have an enrichment facility. And I don't know how you negotiate that. The Iranians, I don't think this regime can give it up. They are so dug into it. And I don't think the international community can accept anything less than they have to give up the enrichment program. So maybe I'm wrong. I think we ought to put as much pressure on the regime as we can going into the negotiations. I think it's because of the pressure they've agreed to restart negotiations. And maybe if the regime really feels that its survival is at stake, maybe they will accept a deal. I don't know. We ought to try it. I would offer, though, two other things that we should think about. One is, as we put that pressure in the international way, in a way that I think the Obama administration has done quite effectively, is we put pressure on the regime. What are the Iranian people thinking as they see Ben Ali go down, Mubarak go down, Gaddafi go down, hopefully Assad goes down? What are they thinking when they go into elections in 2013 for another president, assuming the supreme leader does not abolish the post of president, and where the regime will once again pick in a rigged election? Will the Iranian people decide maybe they're entitled to something better and try to rise up again as they did in 2009? That's something to watch. And finally, the last thing I would say is if we need to buy time, and I've got to be, there is a spectrum of things between mere diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, and conventional military action. There are things that can be done to set back programs and disable programs. And I would be, and I think the administration is, putting all their effort into those kinds of activities so that if we need to do it, we can set back this program in a way that is not directly attributable to the United States and therefore avoid some of the consequences that Dr. Brzezinski outlined if you go into overt, explicit, conventional military activity. We need options in that space to allow us to buy time. People say, and my friend Bob Gates said, well, you know, those kinds of things I'm talking about might buy you 2 or 3 years. Amos Yadlin, who was one of the pilots who flew the mission for Israel against the Osiris reactor in 1982 in Iraq, recounts that the pilots got together who were going to fly that mission, and they had 2 questions. They said, one, is this a one-way mission? And the Israeli leadership said, well, we'll try to get you back, but yeah, it may be a one-way mission. They said, fine, we get that. Now, and then how long will this set back the Iraqi nuclear program? And they said, you know, a couple, 3 years. And their reaction was, fine, we'll take it, a couple, 3 years. And one thing led to another, and Saddam Hussein actually never got a nuclear weapon. So I think buying time in this process that does not bring the kinds of consequences Dr. Brzezinski talked about may be the best we can do. And that's what we ought to be working towards.
Just a thought about it. I want to ask only 2 more questions, a couple more questions before we get some questions from the audience. There are microphones on the aisles, and you can pull up there if you like to ask a question. But I just want to, on the Iran issue, just a comment, which is, when I look at, Iran, obviously its power is probably exaggerated militarily. The capacity to retaliate in a conventional sense is probably limited. There's talk of having missiles that can hit Israel, and obviously Hezbollah, the Israeli public expect Hezbollah to, at least the majority of the Israeli public expect Hezbollah to come on board, although Hezbollah said that's not automatic.
Right.
But when I watched just over the past few days, which just a few very rudimentary rockets, really cheaply made and very primitive in some ways, are fired from Gaza after Israel assassinated a Islamic Jihad leader in Gaza, paralyzed Israel for several days. Just a few rockets being fired every day paralyzes a country for a week, with people sleeping underground, 1 million people in southern Israel, even though these are rudimentary. In the 5 weeks with Hezbollah, it paralyzed the economy. So while we're talking about in the scale of winning a war or losing a war, maybe it's more than that. That is the capacity to just inflict enough uncertainty to make life unbearable. That is something that has to be taken into account.
Well, I think what has to be taken into account is that you can have pretty clear ideas as to what you will be doing and what might be happening in the initial phases if you decide to have a war. You have absolutely no idea how it's going to end and how long it will take. And I think that's something we cannot lose sight of in talking about this issue. Iran could be a threat. It might be a threat. It might not be a threat. But if we take military action, we'll create circumstances which will become increasingly unpredictable. And it's not going to be action by the international community. It will be either by the Israelis alone or by us becoming involved somehow. The rest of the international community is going to be sitting on the sidelines. Our friends will be feeling sorry for us. Our rivals will be rubbing their hands and benefiting from it. So we have to, I think, strategically in our minds cross this Rubicon. Are we prepared to go to war? And I'm prepared to say no, that the costs are too high and there are other ways of coping with it. And there are. Just consider the following. For the last X number of years, Japan and South Korea have been threatened by North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, which has tested them, and which has delivery systems. Yet neither Japan nor South Korea is clamoring that there be an attack on North Korea. Why? A very obvious and clear reason. They have ironclad commitments from the United States that the United States would react as if it itself was attacked. For 30 years, we did that for the European states. And we avoided a war with the Soviet Union. And that could have been a very big enterprise. And yet we had that. My personal view is that if the negotiations don't move into a positive direction, we then issue an ironclad commitment to all of the states in the Middle East that first, if they do not proliferate, And two, if they are threatened by Iran, which is seeking or obtaining nuclear weapons, and this applies to all of the states in the Middle East and Israel specifically, we will view it as directed against us, requiring the kind of response we would make if we were attacked ourselves. I frankly think that's far more credible and more of an umbrella for everybody than the notion, well, perhaps if the Iranians have the bomb, maybe they'll threaten somebody, maybe not, and in the meantime, maybe the Israelis will do this, and we'll have no choice to go in. I think we have to be very clear on this. And if we're clear on this, I think the kind of statistics you cited regarding American public opinion, regarding Israeli public opinion, regarding the majority of the Jewish public opinion in America would support such an outcome. And I think that is a better way of avoiding the sort of uncertainties involved in this if negotiations don't succeed. Otherwise, I agree with you, Steve, that negotiations will have to address some of these very difficult problems, and it may not work. But if it doesn't work, I think we shouldn't leave it open as to what might or might not happen. I think there are some things that are better than others. I think deterrence deserves a chance to be tried. It has worked. The Iranians are not crazy. They're not going to commit suicide.
I think this is a very useful discussion to have. The kinds of things that will come out in discussion is people will say, yes, but North Korea is really an insular regime. It is not a messianic regime. It hasn't really supported terrorism for almost a decade. Iran is a very different regime in a very different part of the world, and we should have that conversation. And the second thing that I worry about deterrence is I have no doubt that the arrangement that Dr. Brzezinski described would deter Iran with a nuclear weapon from attacking the United States or one of their neighbors with a nuclear weapon. I think that's right. I worry, though, that Iran with a nuclear capability, feeling that it itself, therefore, cannot be attacked, and therefore it is less vulnerable, and therefore it will be more ambitious in its support of terror and its disruption of the neighborhood. And I am worried that some of the other states will not believe us and will want their own nuclear capability at the same time. I may be wrong. This is a useful conversation to have. The one thing I would end on this, and I think this is right, if something needs to be done about Iran, I hope it's of the kind of thing that I talked about rather than conventional military activity, but whatever needs to be done, I think it's going to have to be done by the United States. I think we have more capability than the Israelis, and I think it is not fair to put this on the Israelis. And one of the things I liked about President Obama's speech before AIPAC on this subject was he said, Iran is not just Israel's problem, it's the United States' problem, it's the international community's problem as well. I think that is right, and we do, after all, lead the international community, and on this most important issue, the United States has to lead.
I agree with it. It has to lead, but it has to lead responsibly, because this business about international community sounds good, but if there is a war, let's have no any illusions about it. We're going to be alone. The international community is not going to be joining that. And you know, on the messianic business, a country that has survived 3,000 years and has a very impressive history is not characterized by suicidal messianism. They may be messianic, but they're not suicidal. I mean, I have dealt with Iranians under very difficult circumstances. They're clever, they're devious, they're complicated, they're manipulative, they don't keep their promises, but they're smart and they're concerned about their self-interest. That's not the behavior of a country that's suicidal. You know, to believe that and to act on it to start a war, that I think is suicidal, actually.
Well, that's a really interesting conversation, as you said. It may be another time for that. I want to ask the last substantive question, which is on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's back in the news. It almost got out of hand the last few days. The Egyptian military was panicking almost because that's the one thing they fear if there's a full Israeli assault in Gaza and there's no firewall in Egypt, that it could disrupt all of the priorities. This issue has been muted by the fact that there hasn't been much violence. We have our own elections that have distracted from it, the Arab awakening, the Iran issue. It has led people to think that it's no longer important for American foreign policy. I want to ask both of you right now, in terms of the centrality of this issue, you've both dealt with it. We've dealt with the Middle East over decades. Start with you, Dr. Brzezinski, and then go to Mr. Hadley on how important is this issue for American policy in the Middle East?
Specifically, which issue?
The Israeli-Palestinian question specifically.
Well, I think it's residually very important. Right now it's overshadowed by some other issues. You know, Syria, Iran, uncertainty even in Egypt. So on the scale of priorities, sort of not at the top of the pile, so to speak, but it's an enduring problem which in the long run puts at stake not only our influence in the region, which is, as I have emphasized, eroding, but which ultimately will be a mortal threat to Israel. Because if that issue is not resolved in an equitable fashion between the Israelis and Palestinians, the chances of Israel becoming an integral part, a creative and secure part of the Middle East decline. And if the Middle East is going to assert itself and cease being, as it was until recent history, first the playground for the Ottoman Empire, then an area dominated by the British and the French, lately by us, if it becomes self-contained and self-assertive, the prospects for Israel are not very promising. So I think from a moral as well as political point of view, this is an important priority. And I am an optimist in the sense that I think the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians are prepared for what could be called a fair settlement. The Geneva Accords are a good example of that. But it will never happen without determined American initiative.
You agree?
Nobody has worked harder than Shibley, Telhami, on trying to come up with ideas to make the negotiating track work. I think for the near term, the next year or two, negotiations are not on. There's too much talk about Iran. I think what I say is that in some sense, it seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants a negotiation without an outcome, and President Abbas wants an outcome without a negotiation. And there's just, their politics don't permit it. So what do we do? Well, the thing that I think is so important is what the Palestinians have done on the West Bank over the last 2 years, which is to build a society even under occupation with security forces that are increasingly taking responsibility for security and for the governmental institutions of a free Palestinian state. There is economic progress on the West Bank. People are feeling more secure. Life is better. It is why the West Bank has not turned to violence, notwithstanding the Arab Spring. It is very important that that be preserved, not just for the benefit of the Palestinians who are finally enjoying some prosperity and peace, but also to keep it quiet for Israel's sake. And what I think can be done, and I hope that quietly, so it is not political, Israelis are talking to Palestinians about how that process can continue, how as security is maintained by Palestinian forces, Israelis can step back and quietly cede more territory for Palestinian security presence and allow greater Palestinian economic activity on the West Bank. I think that is the kind of thing that, as Jesse Jackson would have said, keeps hope alive, allows the Palestinian people to preserve the progress they've made, and avoids a resort to violence of which Israel will ultimately be the second victim after the Palestinian people. I think that's the most we can do right now, but it is important to do.
And we only have time for a couple of questions, so please come to the microphone if you have questions. As a final note, I just want to mention Dr. Brzezinski's new book, Strategic Vision, brilliant new book, almost instantly a bestseller. He actually signed a few copies that are available outside, and I hope someone we'll ask you about this because I think in your description of the shift in distribution of power to Asia and your prescription for an American resurgence and a stable international order that would allow us to deal with common issues for humanity, you interestingly suggest the expansion of the West, the concept of the West to include Russia, coming back to Russia, and Turkey. But I always wonder why specifically Turkey, but there is not Egypt or Iran, two comparable countries in size. I think it is something that I hope somebody will ask about and get to address. I'll leave that out.
The short answer is part of Turkey is in Europe.
Good answer. Good answer.
Thank you.
Let's start with a question there, please.
Thank you all and Mrs. Sadat for the very excellent conversation. I'm curious, as there's a growing rift between Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader, and whether you think that's an obstacle or an opportunity to negotiations.
Let me take one other question from this side before you answer. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is more technical. I'm looking at your questionnaire, but perhaps a question that was not asked is to ask the American public if they believe that negotiation and peaceful means will lead Iran to perhaps abandon their ambitions.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. Sir.
I'm pessimistic on the negotiations, but think they need to be tried. But we've been at this for a while, and it goes to the question actually about Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader. Interestingly enough, we actually had an agreement